They told her she was a burden, then pushed her out. "You're a burden, Grandma. You're ruining our lives." Those words fell like stones. With them, the grandchildren whom Donna Amalia had raised all her life shut the door on her. The house that once rang with her cooking and her stories became the place that turned its back. At 82, carrying only a small bag of clothes and a pocket full of memories, she stepped away from the family that had stopped seeing her as anything but trouble. They celebrated her leaving as if they had shed a weight. They laughed and breathed easier, certain they had solved a problem. What they did not know, what they never guessed, was that tucked into that little bag with her worn shawl and favorite handkerchief was a quiet secret. A hidden inheritance Donna Amalia had kept safe her whole life. By the time they understood what she had truly taken with her, it was too late. Regret, like a slow tide, washed over them then. But the story of loss had begun long before that last slammed door. At first, when she returned to live with her daughter's children, everything looked hopeful. They greeted her with smiles and open arms. They called her Grandma, the way they once had. She was the one who had steadied them, fed them, told them the stories by the fire when thunder roared outside. She had taught them how to tie knots, mend a shirt, and make the bitter taste of medicine go down with a kind word. The little ones who clung to her skirts were grown now, but for a while they seemed glad she was there. But the good days did not last. Time passed and small sharp things started to show. Words that once meant love began to lose their warmth. "Grandma, you can rest. We've got this," they said at first, in a voice that sounded kind but carried something else, a hurry to move her out of the way. Donna Amalia watched their faces and felt a confusion that settled heavy in her chest. She had lived believing family was to hold you up, to be soft when life bruised you. Now she learned those promises can fray. At first it was small. "You're just in the way in the kitchen," someone muttered one afternoon. She remembered sitting by the doorway, hands folded, waiting for one of them to ask for help the way they had when they were children. No one noticed she was there. Step by step the house grew colder. Her days became measured by silences that hurt more than yelling ever could. She kept quiet because the wisdom of her years told her it was better to hold pain inside than to make trouble for others. So she held it. She swallowed the stings and kept trying to be useful. Then came the beans. She cooked them the way she always had. Slow, patient, with a little bacon and a lot of care. Food, for Donna Amalia, had always been a language of love. She put the steaming pot on the table and waited to see the faces she had raised. Instead, she saw a look she would never forget. Disapproval. One grown grandson looked down at the bowl and said, "Are you making beans again?" As if that was the most boring thing in the world. He picked up his plate and walked away, replacing the warm pot with a packet of instant noodles he opened with impatient fingers. They ate those noodles like a verdict. No one said sorry. No one asked why she had bothered. The small ritual of that meal, something she had done for decades, was dismissed without a glance. When the pot sat cold on the stove, Donna Amalia felt as if someone had taken the last ribbon that tied her to that house and cut it quietly. From then on, contempt seeped into the corners where her laughter used to live. The beans were only the first crack. They widened into a rift that could not be mended by apologies because no apologies came. Silence became the loudest thing in the house. It swallowed her stories and made her steps smaller. She walked past the living room and saw her grandchildren racing through life. Phones in hand, always busy, always late. They did not stop to ask how her day had been. They did not ask about her memories of the fields, the harvests, the old festivals when neighbors shared bread and songs. When she spoke, sometimes softly, sometimes with a spark in her eyes, they laughed behind their hands or changed the subject. The life she had known, the lessons she had handed down, now seemed like an embarrassment to them. The old ways had no place in their bright, hurried world. So she learned to sit in the backyard under the shade of a tree she had planted many years before. There, with an old radio that hissed and searched for stations, she listened for news from beyond the garden walls. The world felt far away, and her own small world had shrunk into that patch of grass. She watched them pass by. A grandson rushing to work, a granddaughter hurrying out with a friend, the house door slamming shut like a final act. No one paused. No one asked if she wanted tea or company. She remembered how they used to hang on every word of her storytelling, how their eyes would widen when she spoke of storms and harvest moons. Now those eyes skimmed past her, hungry only for the next quick thing. She tried not to let it show that each day bit a little more at her. She did not make a fuss. She knew herself well enough to understand she would rather shrink than make anyone uncomfortable. She thought stubbornly that perhaps things would return to what they once were. Maybe time would remind them of her worth. But each day proved her hope a little more fragile. The house that had been her life was rearranging itself without asking her consent. The memories she had once used to stitch the family together were pushed into a box no one wanted to open. Sometimes, in the late afternoons when the sun slanted warm across the yard, she let her mind wander back to the rhythms she loved. She would say aloud, as if the words could hold the ghosts of an older world in place, "I used to tell stories from the old days in the fields." She would picture the long rows of corn, the smell of wet earth, the neighbors bringing baskets of fruit. Once those pictures would have brought laughter and questions. Now only the radio answered back with distant voices. The grandkids would laugh behind her back at the tales she told, as if her memories were jokes or relics to mock. That hurt more than any of the louder cruelties. Because she did not fight, others grew bold. Their impatience turned into rudeness, and rudeness hardened into cruelty. They began to act as if her presence used up space that should be for younger things. Invitations stopped coming. Her chair at the table became more symbolic than real. They treated her as an expense of space and breath. Little by little, she stopped venturing through the house the way she once had. She avoided the rooms where her work would be ignored and where her stories would be unwelcome. She moved like a shadow around the edges of their lives. Still, within her, there was a quiet strength. She refused bitterness. She fed that strength with the small rituals that had always kept her steady. Sweeping the back step, mending a torn sleeve, whispering a prayer for the birds that nested in the eaves. She believed in something steadier than the changing moods of people. Faith and patience had roots that went deep into her soul. They kept her upright when the rest of the world tilted away. But the more she tried to be small and unobtrusive, the more she became invisible. That invisibility was its own kind of pain. It made her shrink not only from sight, but from voice. The thing that hurt most was not the sharp words. Those could be borne. But the way her life's meaning was erased by indifference. She had raised them, fed them, wiped tears from scraped knees, stayed up through fevers and nightmares. To be treated now as though she were merely a relic took from her the dignity she had earned with years. As she sat under the tree, sometimes a young voice would call from the garden, "Grandma, don't bother," or "Just sit there." They would hurry by, eyes fixed on screens that flashed and glowed with other people's lives. Donna Amalia watched the New World race and felt the small, steady pulse of the old one in her own chest. She did not lash out. She could not bring herself to cause trouble. Instead, she listened, collected, and remembered. She kept in her hands small things of value, the careful stitches, the small herbs pressed into paper, a list of names and dates she had kept for decades. Little things to others, perhaps, treasures to her. When they finally closed the house door on her with those cruel words, "You're a burden, Grandma," she left quietly. She did not make a scene. She took her bag, the shawl she loved, the radio that hummed, and the secret she had carried for years. She walked into the street, and then into the late afternoon light where she felt oddly free. Not because she had been welcomed, but because she had chosen to keep her own dignity. The grandchildren cheered behind the walls. They thought they had ended a chapter. They did not know they had let go of something richer than they could ever imagine. That treasure she carried was more than money or trinkets. It was a quiet inheritance of knowledge and careful savings hidden away in places only she knew. It was the proof of a life lived with work and thrift, of jars filled with spare coins, of folded papers with names and promises, things that had meaning and could change lives in ways the grandchildren never guessed. The secret had been hers to keep, a promise to herself that she would not become truly powerless, By the time those grandchildren understood what they had lost, the moment to repair was past. They searched too late for the warmth their own hands had pushed away. Regret is a heavy thing, and when it comes after the door is closed, it carries no comfort. But for Donna Amalia, the ending was not only sorrow, it was also proof that she had a life beyond their small judgments. She had kept her worth even when others could not see it. She had not begged. She had not begged for affection, only for recognition that a life can be more than a nuisance. So she left and walked on. She walked under skies that had once watched her dance at harvest, under trees she had planted with hope, carrying in her bag the small map of everything she had saved. Sometimes she would sit by the roadside and tell a neighbor's child a story about the rain or the seed that would not give up. Sometimes she would hum the old songs, and a few people would stop and listen. Not everyone would close a door on her. Some doors stayed open. Time, she had learned, was a circle. Sometimes you are pushed out of a house, and sometimes the next stranger at your bench becomes the family you did not expect. She did not let herself be defined only by what others refused to take from her. Instead, she kept the dignity she had always held, and she let her life be guided by that quiet inner compass. She never lost the habit of telling the stories that shaped her, stories of work, of small mercies, of the way people can be both cruel and kind without meaning to be. She kept speaking into the air and into the ears of those who would listen, teaching with the slow, patient voice of someone who knows the way seasons turn. Even when the house that had once been her center rejected her, she did not stop being herself. She kept making beans for anyone who would sit with her, and she kept tending the small sprout of hope that had always lived inside. She carried on, step by step, memory by memory, with the quiet courage of a woman who had loved hard and lived honestly. And every day, in the shade of the tree she had planted, with the old radio warming her lap, she kept doing the one thing that held her true. She continued telling her stories, but now more than ever she told them to herself. The grandmother had become an absent presence in her grandchildren's lives, but the strength she carried within her, silent and steady, would never fade. She was still there, waiting for the right moment for her legacy to be seen, understood, and finally recognized. The day began with the soft sound of rain tapping against the window, as if the sky too were tired, reflecting the weight of what was happening inside the house. Donna Amalia got up early, as she always did. Her steps, now slower, didn't stop her from rising at dawn. A habit life had taught her since her youth. She made the coffee, the same routine as always, without fuss, without complaint. The house was still quiet, but she already knew that soon everyone would be up, caught up in their own worlds, ignoring her presence. But that day, something unexpected happened. Donna Amalia was on her way to the bathroom like any other day, when, taking a step, her feet slipped on the damp floor. The ground seemed like a treacherous enemy. She tried to steady herself, but couldn't. Her older, more fragile body didn't respond as it once had. She fell with a loud thud, her body hitting the cold floor. The shock was great, but for someone like Donna Amalia, who had already faced so many storms in life, the physical pain seemed fleeting. What truly hurt was the silence that followed. She called out, but the house, so full of people, seemed not to hear. "Someone, please," she tried to shout, but the voice that had once been strong and full of authority came out weak, nearly inaudible. What had once been a house full of life now felt like a scene of abandonment. Donna Amalia lay there on the cold floor for what felt like an eternity, until, with a strength she didn't even know she had, she managed to get up. Her wrist hurt, but she didn't dare complain. She stood slowly and began to clean the floor where she had fallen, as if nothing had happened. She didn't want to be seen. She didn't want anyone to see her fragile. And the pain, though present, was muffled by the need to maintain the image she believed was the only acceptable one. When she finished cleaning, she carried on as if nothing had happened, with a serene face, a calm expression, but her body now reminded her just how much she was being left behind. The next day, Donna Amalia got up early as always, and with her wrist still aching, she made coffee for everyone. No one noticed anything was wrong. She served a coffee with a trembling hand, and no one noticed. The grandchildren entered the kitchen in a rush without looking at her. They were so absorbed in their own concerns that in that moment, donor Amalia became just a shadow, just another figure in the background unnoticed. She said nothing, made no gesture to draw attention. What she really wanted was for someone to notice her pain, her frailty, but no one did. She didn't expect pity, but she wished at least to have been noticed, to have been treated with the same care she had once given her grandchildren during their childhood. Deep down, Dorna Amalia wished they remembered the love she had always shown them, that they knew she was still there. Despite everything, but the hours passed and the emptiness grew deeper. The pain in Dorna Amalia's wrist wasn't just physical, it represented something much greater. It carried the pain of being forgotten, the loneliness imposed by indifference. The worst part wasn't the fall itself, but the fact that after it happened, no one cared. The grandmother, who had once been a pillar who held the entire family together with her love and dedication, was now seen only as a distant presence, something to be tolerated, but no longer respected. It was as if she no longer had value to her grandchildren, as if her usefulness had expired with the passing years. That morning, after serving coffee with her aching wrist, Dorna Amalia quietly retreated to her usual corner, making sure not to be a bother. She sat in her chair, staring into the void, absorbing a pain no one could see. The world outside seemed to keep moving forward, while she remained stuck, trapped in a reality where she no longer had a voice, where her presence was invisible. But deep down, Donna Amalia knew her struggle wasn't for a seat at the table, nor for recognition that would never come. Her struggle was internal. She didn't need others to see her. What she longed for was to find peace within herself, even if the world had forgotten her. And so with an aching body and a heavy heart, she waited silently for the next day, the next moment, the next silence. She was in no hurry. The day was bright, and the house was full as always. The sound of conversations and children's laughter filled the air while the adults moved around the house, each wrapped up in their own interests. Donna Amalia, as always, stayed in her corner in her little space, quietly observing everything from afar. It wasn't for lack of desire that she kept her distance, but the weight of past words and the indifference she now received made her prefer the quiet of solitude. She knew that with each passing day, her presence seemed more unnecessary. Yet she still clung to the idea that her family might see her as more than just a burden. She was preparing a simple dish, something she knew her grandchildren still liked, softly singing to herself as she used to while cooking. The smell of food filled the house, but none of the grandchildren came to ask what she was making or offer help. She felt a silent longing for the days when everyone would gather around the table to share a meal and stories, but those days seemed to be drifting away like a lost dream. Then during breakfast, the oldest granddaughter, Mariana, walked into the kitchen with a tired, impatient expression. She glanced quickly at her grandmother, who was finishing setting the rice on the table, and without thinking, she let out the words that had been held back for too long. "You're a burden, Grandma. You're getting in the way of our lives. No one asked you to come." The words fell like heavy stones, cutting through the silence of the house and sinking deep into Dorna Amalia's heart. The children, who had been quietly eating, immediately stopped. The youngest grandson, Joe, looked at his grandmother while I died, but before he could say anything, Mariana silenced him with a sharp look. Donna Amalia, who had her back to them, couldn't see their faces, but she could feel the weight of those words. She didn't react. She didn't yell, didn't ask for an explanation. She simply paused for a moment, and with the calm of someone who had weathered many storms, carried on. She picked up her cloth bag, the only one she ever carried, and without a sound walked out of the kitchen. Her steps were slow but steady, as if each movement carried both the weight of sorrow and the relief of letting go. Mariana stood there watching her grandmother leave the room, unsure of what to do. What did she want to let out such cruel words? But once spoken, words can't be taken back. What was said, and the grandmother, silent, kept walking out of the house. The children watched with curious eyes, but none of the adults were present to grasp what was really happening. Joe, the youngest, wanted to speak, maybe to defend his grandmother, but the pressure of Mariana's stern gaze silenced him. She, always so strict with the younger ones, didn't want anyone to question her authority in that moment. The boy, confused and with a heavy heart, didn't fully understand what was happening, but he felt that something wasn't right. Donna Amalia didn't look back as she walked to her room. It was as if her soul had been preparing for that moment for a long time, as if she already knew the end of her place in that house was only a matter of time. She went to her room, picked up her bag, and calmly began folding her clothes. The movement was gentle, almost like a silent farewell. Each fold of the fabric felt like a goodbye to a life she didn't want to leave, but somehow knew she had to. She felt her presence no longer had a place in her grandchildren's home. And as heavy as her heart was, the decision to leave came from the depths of her soul. The neighbor, who had been standing by the door, witnessing the scene unnoticed, approached. Donna Amalia had her bag ready, her face calm but her eyes tired like someone who no longer had tears left to cry. The woman, sensing the pain, asked, "Where are you going?" Donna Amalia, with a distant look and a serene voice, replied, "To wherever I still fit in, even if it's just in memory." And so Donna Amalia left quietly without causing a scene. She simply went. She left behind the house that was once hers, the family that in some way had stopped being hers too. She didn't need to shout. She didn't ask for explanations. The words that had wounded her so deeply still echoed in her mind. But she no longer had the strength to stay in that place. She lay silent left. Yet somehow the image of her departure stayed etched in everyone's memory like a wound that would take time to heal. Donna Amalia walked slowly through the streets of Thesmal village, the weight of the bag on her shoulder reminding her of all the years she had carried not only her own burdens, but those of others as well. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the road ahead mirrored her life full of hardships, but also full of resignation. She didn't look back. She knew there was nothing left to be done there. The decision had been made. But before she could go much farther, something made her stop. Her neighbor Donna Adelaide, who lived in the house next door, had seen everything from the gate. She saw the oldest granddaughter, Mariana, hurling harsh words at the grandmother. She saw the grandmother walk away without looking back, bag in hand, her expression serene but marked by pain. Donna Adelaide, who had always had a fondness for Donna Amalia, couldn't just stand by. She knew that what she had witnessed was a turning point. She knew that Donna Amalia, despite her outward calm, was saying goodbye, and what she felt wasn't just pity. It was the recognition that the grandmother was being cast aside in a way she did not deserve. Donna Adelaide hurried out into the street, her steps quick and firm, trying to reach Donna Amalia before she disappeared around Thabend in the road. "Stay at my place, Donna Amalia. Just for today," she said, her voice full of concern. She knew that despite everything, the grandmother still needed someone to offer her a bit of kindness. She knew that in that moment, Donna Amalia didn't just need a place to stay. She needed a gesture that showed at least one person still cared. But Donna Amar, with the dignity that had always accompanied her, paused only briefly. She looked at Donna Adelaide with tired eyes but not empty ones, the gaze of someone who already knew what life had in store. "A borrowed place doesn't heal heartbreak. It only delays it," she said, her voice soft but firm. Those words weren't just a reply to her neighbor. They were a reflection of her entire life, a life of sacrifice that now seemed to have been in vain. Donna Adelaide looked at Donna Adid, looked at Donna Amalia, knowing there was nothing more to be done. She who had always been there for the grandmother understood that this decision went beyond any offer of shelter. Donna Amalia no longer wanted to be remembered as a nuisance. She wanted to leave with the same dignity she had always carried, with no one feeling burdened by her, even if it meant walking away without a single farewell hug. The neighbor tried once more, heart-heavy, but Donna Amalia, with a sad smile, thanked her for the gesture, and without another word continued on her way. She no longer wanted to be part of that house that no longer wanted her. She only wanted to leave, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion, of resignation from knowing that what she was leaving behind could no longer be recovered. Donna Adelaide stood in silence, watching Donna Amalia's figure grow smaller as she walked away. The sound of her fading footsteps echoed in her mind. She didn't know what would happen next, but she had the feeling that in that moment, Donna Amalia's story had reached a point of no return. She had left without making a scene, without arguments, without asking for forgiveness or giving explanations, only with the quiet wisdom of someone who knew that the end of one chapter in life often had to be lived in silence, and that many times leaving is the only way to find peace. And so Donna Amalia went in her way, leaving behind the house and the grandchildren who now saw her only as a burden. She didn't know what lay ahead, but at least she felt she was taking control of her own story. Even if no one understood her decision, she knew it was the right time to go. The pain she felt was no longer just physical. She felt the sting of rejection, but also the ache of belated recognition. She left without expecting anything more. No forgiveness, no acknowledgement. She left with the dignity of someone who had given all she could and then some. And in a way, that was already enough for her. The next morning, the house was quieter than ever. The grandchildren were used to the frantic pace of daily life, the chores, the pressures of adulthood, but something felt different. The air was heavy, thick with a kind of emptiness that no one quite knew how to face. Donna Amalia, who had once been a constant presence, was now a painful absence. That morning, the grandchildren were more at ease. Donna Amalia's absentee, who had become a kind of shadow in the everyday routine, didn't seem to be cause for concern. On the contrary, there was a strange sense of relief in the air, as if the house could finally breathe again. It was as if the last piece of an unnecessary puzzle had been removed. They hadn't realized how much her now missing presence left behind a hollow space. And yet, while life continued in its hurried rhythm, there was something the grandchildren hadn't noticed. What Donna Amalia had taken with her, she hadn't taken much, just a few clothes. The old bag that had accompanied her for years, and a cloth she always wore over her shoulder, a silent symbol of her struggles. But what she had truly taken, what no one imagined she possessed, were the savings she had guarded so carefully, the treasure she had hidden for so long. What seemed insignificant to them was, in fact, the reflection of an entire lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. The grandchildren began to notice the absence of the wooden box that had always been tucked away at the back of Donna Amalia's wardrobe. They knew their grandmother kept things in there that were precious to her, but they had never bothered to ask what they were. To them, that little hiding spot was just another one of those old lady relics, one of the many things she carried with her through the years. But when they searched for the box, they realized it was no longer there. The wardrobe was empty. What had seemed like nothing more than an object of curiosity now became a symbol of something much more meaningful. Something Donna Amalia had taken without anyone even noticing. They looked around, confused, and began to question one another, but the answer wasn't in the room. The box, once a forgotten trinket, had vanished like a vital piece of something they had never bothered to understand. She took the little she had. Let her go and not come back, some of them said with disdain, unable to grasp the weight of what they were saying. To them, it was just another sign that Donna Amalia had wanted to get rid of everything. Just an old woman who no longer wanted to be a burden. But someone in the village, someone who had always cared for Donna Amalia, whispered something different. What she was keeping was old gold. Those words began to spread, and the grandchildren slowly began to understand that there was something much deeper in what Donna Amalia had hidden all those years. That box wasn't just a collection of old things. It held in truth the product of a lifetime of sacrifice, of tireless work. What they had seen as worthless was in fact the reflection of something far greater. The value of everything she had done for her family, the weight of every choice, the cost of her unconditional love. That morning, understanding began to dawn. But it was already too late. The treasure Donna Amalia had guarded so carefully, not for herself, but for whoever might need it one day, was now gone. She had left and with her. She had taken more than the grandchildren could have ever imagined. They had lost something they would never get back. The true wealth she had preserved wasn't in the money. It was in the lesson of humility, the understanding of time's worth, and the price of sacrifice. As the grandchildren tried to make sense of what had happened, the feeling of loss settled in. They didn't yet realize it, but they were about to discover that instead of finding what they had been looking for, they had lost something far more valuable than any material possession. Donna Amalia, with her silent wisdom had given more than they could ever comprehend. And in leaving, she had taken with her the one thing they needed most. The lesson that the true value of life is not in what can be seen or touched, but in what is carried in the heart. Life in the house went on. The grandchildren, who had once felt relieved by Dona Amalia's departure, soon began to notice the stillness her absence had brought. The emptiness that once seemed like a chance to breathe now became a void they couldn't quite name. But no one spoke about it. The silence, which had settled like a living presence in the house, remained, and without Donna Amalia, the house seemed colder and more lifeless by the day. A few days passed, and the eldest granddaughter Mariana was in the kitchen trying to tidy up the mess her grandmother had left behind without realizing that in doing so she was beginning to rediscover pieces of the past she had long neglected. At the back of a drawer where Donna Amalia used to keep her kitchen utensils, Mariana found a letter. It was folded simply but with care, as if it had been tucked away with a special tenderness. It was a letter Mariana had never seen before, and curiosity made her stop everything to read it. The letter was brief, but its words carried an emotional weight Mariana wasn't prepared for. The handwriting was simple but full of feeling. She read it in a low voice, as if afraid someone might hear. If one day kind words are missing, look for the ones I left behind. Beside the letter was an old notebook, its pages yellowed with time. Mariana, hands trembling, opened it. Inside were recipes Donna Amalia had collected over her lifetime, prayers she recited during hard times, advice she had written for her. Most poignantly, a list of all the grandchildren with dates of when each had fallen ill, and how she, with patience and care, had nursed them back to health. Each name, each date carried with it a silent memory of love and devotion, a devotion that had never been acknowledged, or at least not as it should have been. The notebook was filled with small notes, as if Donna Amalia had recorded every little detail of her life in service to that family. On every page lived a memory of both pain and joy, of struggles and victories that had slowly been forgotten in thrash of everyday life. Holding the notebook in her hands, Mariana felt overwhelmed by a feeling she couldn't quite define. There was shame, but also a growing sense of loss. The grandmother, who had always been invisible to her, was now revealing herself in a way Mariana could no longer ignore. She skimmed the pages, realizing she was looking at something she likely never would have understood before. Donna Amalia hadn't just given of herself. She had been the silent presence, always there, always caring, always waiting, never asking for anything in return. She, who had been so overlooked, was now leaving behind a legacy of quiet love that no one had seen while she was still around. And now, reading those words, Mariana felt a deep ache in her chest. She realized something had been lost forever, something she could never get back. The letter continued, "When silence becomes heavy, remember that peace is found in caring for others, and that love is always more valuable when it's shared." Mariana felt the weight of those words. She had been so harsh with Donna Amalia, so quick to dismiss her as a bothersome presence, never realizing the immense richness her grandmother carried inside her. She stood up, still holding the notebook, and looked around the house. The kitchen, once full of warmth and life, now felt emptiest, as if Donna Amalia's soul had been removed from it. It was as if everything she had done had been forgotten. The worst part was that Mariana herself hadn't noticed. She sat down at the table, the notebook still in her hands, and let the tears fall. She didn't know if she was crying for the grandmother she had never truly valued, for the pain she had caused, or for the pain she now felt inside. But something inside her shifted in that moment, a deep, painful realization that Donna Amalia, with her quiet presence and tireless love, had left behind more than just a notebook filled with recipes and prayers. She had left behind the testimony of a life dedicated to care, to love, and to sacrifice, something Mariana had never seen in her hurried, disconnected life. It was too late. But what Mariana didn't know was that the notebook, those simple words, would begin to change the way she saw her grandmother, and perhaps the way she saw everything she had known up until then. In the days that followed Donna Amalia's departure, the entire village felt her absence in a silent yet profound way. At first, no one seemed to realize that something was wrong. The grandchildren carried on with their rushed routines, and life in the village appeared to continue with its usual bustle. But slowly, the emptiness left behind by the grandmother began to spread like a shadow, reaching even those who had never paid much attention to her. Donna Amalia had always been a woman of quiet presence, and her departure, though without any fuss, began to echo in ways no one had expected. The first to feel her absence was Dorna Adelaide, the neighbor who had tried to shelter her before she left. She who knew of Dorna Amalia's kindness and generosity began to wonder where she might have gone, as she hadn't seen her around the village since that day. Dorna Adelaide had known her since their children were small, and she was certain that Dorna Amalia would never disappear without leaving some kind of trace. That's when she started asking around, but no one could say exactly where Donna Amalia had gone. Meanwhile, people began to remember Donna Amalia in ways they hadn't before. At the midwife's house, the soap she had made with such care was still there, carrying the same signature touch of affection she left on everything she did. On the main street at the market, people started to comment on her absence, recalling how she was always ready to help when someone needed care. At the village nursing home, an old radio that Donna Amalia had left behind still sat in the corner. Next to it, a simple note read, "For when the silence becomes too much." For those who had known Donna Amalia, the words were unmistakable. She more than anyone understood when silence could be comforting and knew exactly how to leave her mark, never asking for recognition. The search for Donna Amalia Biganto spread through the village like wildfire, and the sense that something had been lost, something that could no longer be recovered, settled over everyone. People began to look around the places where she used to be, and what they found was surprising. Every corner, every patch of ground she had walked on now seemed filled with quiet traces of her generosity. At the village church, the garden bench's handmaid still bore the initials of the youngest granddaughter, delicately carved by donor Amalia herself. Those initials, once carved with the simple intention of delighting a child, had now become a symbol of the care of a woman who, even when ignored by her own grandchildren, continued to love unconditionally. And in the churchyard, where no one had looked closely before, there was another bench carefully sculpted with the name of the same granddaughter engraved on it. When people began to notice these details, they started to understand that Dorna Amalia had always been far more present in their lives than they had realized. The search for Dorna Amalia became more than a physical search. It became a search for what she had represented to the community. Somehow she had left her mark everywhere, but no one had noticed until now. As they began to look for her, the village started to recognize how rich she had been in kindness and simple gestures, and how those small acts were the true essence of a life well lived. Donor Amalia, with her quiet and steady presence, had given more than anyone had ever realized. Every item she left behind, every small act of care, held a value that none of her grandchildren had understood while she was still there. She had been the invisible foundation upon which many things in the village had been built, but no one had seen it. Now without her, the absence of her hands, of her generous heart, was undeniable. Little by little the village began to come together in this search, and the truth slowly began to emerge. Donna Amalia hadn't left without leaving anything behind. On the contrary, she had planted a legacy of gestures, memories, and quiet deeds so deep that even in her absence, they continued to touch everyone's lives. While the grandchildren remained caught up in their own lives, the village gradually began to understand the true value of Dorna Amalia. And in that moment, with the echo of her actions reverberating through every corner of the community, it became clear that, although she had been ignored and treated like a burden by her own family, she had left behind a far greater inheritance than any material wealth. She had left the mark of her kindness, a quiet kindness that spoke louder than any word or harsh gesture. She had unknowingly taught everyone a lesson that would transcend time, that in the end, what truly matters isn't the things we accumulate, but the love and care we leave behind. A few months had passed since Donna Amalia's departure, and the village, which once moved without pause, now found itself slowed by reflection. Each person who had crossed paths with Donna Amalia began to ask themselves How could they have been so insensitive? The marks she had left silent and subtle were becoming visible. The radio at the nursing home, the bench at the church, the recipes in her notebook. Each detail now spoke louder than any words ever had. Then one day, something happened. Donna Maria reappeared, but not as the old woman everyone had once ignored. She didn't return seeking apologies or forgiveness. She didn't need them. She was there, stronger and more serene than ever. The day was bright, like any other, but something in the air felt different. Donna Amalia appeared in the village square wearing a light-colored dress, in stark contrast to the worn-out clothes she used to wear. She walked slowly but with her head held high and her shoulders steady. As soon as people saw her, they fell silent. She looked lighter, more grounded, as if the weight of years and pain had finally been shed. The entire village came to a halt. Those who had once looked at her with disdain now gazed at her with a mix of surprise and reverence. She who had been left behind now walked with dignity, with a strength few had ever truly seen. Her grandchildren were among the first to spot her, but they didn't know what to do. The words they had spoken, the gestures of indifference, they all came, rushing back with unbearable weight. They tried to approach her, but something about Donna Amalia held them back. She walked past them, saying nothing, but her eyes said everything. There was no anger, no sadness. She simply passed by, her gaze steady as if she no longer needed anything from them. She had nothing to prove to anyone. Quietly, she had become the woman no one realized they would one day revere. Donna Amalia walked to the center of the village and stopped in front of the square where she used to sit so often. She didn't speak of what had happened. She didn't mention her departure or the cruel words her grandchildren had said. She was there now for something else. Her presence was not about revenge or justice. It was about reclaiming her place in the world, with the dignity that had always been hers, and surprisingly, the village welcomed her back. The women of the community who had once seen her as just a quiet figure in the background now approached her with respect. Donna Amalia was chosen to lead the community's women's group, a role she never asked for, but that was given to her naturally because of the wisdom she carried in her lived experience. With her calm, steady demeanor, she became their leader, the woman who taught by example, never with empty words. She didn't need to explain the value of respect, of sacrifice, or of love. She had lived it. That was enough. When the grandchildren, now more humble and full of remorse, approached her, they had no idea what to say, what could be said after everything that had happened. There were before the woman they had devalued, now seen by everyone with the respect she had always deserved. In silence, they knelt before her without words, as if her very dignity were enough to teach them everything they needed to learn. Donna Amalia, however, said nothing. She simply looked at them with a calm smile, a smile that said, "True wisdom doesn't need to be taught with words." She forgave them not out of obligation, not because they had asked. She forgave them because she understood. Time had already done the most important work. She no longer needed them to feel whole. She had already found her peace. Several months had passed since Donna Amalia's return to the village. As the waters calmed and the rhythm of life resumed its course, something unexpected happened. What had seemed like the closing of a chapter for the old woman who had once been rejected by her own family was, in truth, a new beginning. But there was still something left to be discovered. The grandchildren, now with heavy hearts and eyes more open to the truth, continued to reflect on Donna Amalia's absence. They tried in small ways to reconnect with her, though they knew nothing could undo what had been done. Still they felt that something was missing, something she had left behind. A piece of the puzzle no one had noticed before. It was in the backyard of her old home, now occupied by new residents. That the key to understanding it all had been hidden. One day, without much reason, the eldest grandson, Pedro, found himself back in the empty house, rummaging through old furniture and belongings that remained. He had always avoided everything related to his grandmother. But now, driven by something he couldn't quite explain, perhaps regret or a need for redemption, he felt he had to know more. Maybe it was just curiosity. But whatever it was, it led Pedro to the backyard, The same backyard where Donna Amalia had spent so many of her afternoons. What he found buried among the roots of an old tree was something he never could have imagined. The iron box was covered in dirt, but as he cleared the layers of soil, he saw it was carefully and intentionally hidden. His breath quickened. He pulled it out gently as if it were fragile but also precious. Inside the box, there was more than just documents or some material inheritance. There were land deeds, titles to a piece of land Pedro had never known existed, land he never imagined his grandmother had owned. But there was something else. A letter that now trembled in his hands, his heart pounding faster with every word he read. It said, "Use it only if one day you learn to care for those who once cared for you." Pedro felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. He looked around, almost expecting Donna Amalia to appear and explain everything, but she wasn't there. The truth, the secret she had guarded for so long, was now laid bare before him, and he didn't know how to respond. How had she kept this hidden all these years? How had the woman everyone saw as fragile held something so valuable in her hands? She knew. She knew what could one day happen when her grandchildren would look at her and see only a burden. She knew that time would bring the sting of regret. But she also knew that one day, the truth about what she had done on who she truly was would reveal itself. Donna Amalia hadn't just left behind land or material possessions. She had left behind a legacy of wisdom, something that would only be understood when the time was right. She knew the worth of her life, and her work would be recognized too late. But she was willing to accept that out of love. Pedro, on his knees with the box still in his hands, didn't know what to feel. The pain of regret began to consume him. And the words his grandmother had once spoken to him, words wrapped in silence and patience, finally made sense. He rose slowly, looking around as if searching for a way to make sense of it all. He now stood before the symbol of his own failure, not only for having ignored his grandmother, but for having underestimated her strength and her worth. He knew he couldn't turn back time. The words, the actions, they could not be erased. But with the box in his hands, he now had a chance to honor Donna Amalia in a way that once seemed impossible. And that chance lay not only in the inheritance she had left behind, but in the powerful reminder that no matter how much time passes, a person's true value never disappears. Even in her quiet departure, Donna Amalia had left behind one final lesson. She knew that the greatest inheritance was not what could be touched or counted, but what is planted in the hearts of others. She had planted something far more valuable than land or money. She had planted truths, the lesson that love, respect, and care for others are in the end the only things that truly matter. The village, which once seemed to live in a rushed and superficial way, was now transformed. Donna Amalia's lessons, taught not through words, but through everyday gestures, had touched everyone's hearts. Those who once saw her as a burden now looked back with clearer eyes and saw how much her presence had truly meant. It wasn't a grand revelation or a dramatic event that brought about this change. It was the small yet powerful redefinition of a life that had been simple and filled with love. The grandchildren, now burdened by the weight of genuine remorse, began to reflect on what truly mattered. They realized that although the land deeds and material possessions had value, Donna Amalia's true legacy was something far deeper. It was the quiet wisdom she carried, the patience with which she had waited to be seen, and the unconditional love she gave without expecting anything in return. Everything she had left behind was more than physical. It was what she had cultivated in people-land that could never be measured in money or belongings. When the grandchildren finally gathered in their grandmother's house, the feeling that overtook them was one of deep respect. They didn't say anything at first. There was no need for words. The look they exchanged in silence was enough. They knew that while forgiveness was important, it couldn't erase the years of neglect. But something had changed within them. They began to understand that Donna Amalia's true inheritance wasn't something they could simply claim or divide. It was something that could only be learned. In the village, whenever someone passed by where Donna Amalia used to sit, or whenever her recipes or stories were mentioned, there was a quiet sense of reverence in the air. She had never been more than a simple woman, a quiet grandmother, but now she was an example to everyone. The village had begun to see the old and the simple in a new light. Every corner, every street now seemed to hold a piece of Donna Amalia's legacy. Dot. And the inheritance she left behind was not one her grandchildren could store or show off. It wasn't an inheritance of land or wealth. It was an inheritance of life lessons, the inheritance of dignity, of sacrifice, and above all, of true love, the kind that doesn't seek recognition, but in the end transforms everything around it. Donna Amalia didn't need a will to leave her mark. She did it through her actions, her gestures, and the way she lived. The house where she'd lived stayed empty for a while. But the village in turn became full of something that hadn't existed before: respect and understanding. And whenever one of her grandchildren or anyone in the village would say, "The old is no longer useful," someone would always reply, "But the old is the one who knows where the root is." And so the story of Donna Amalia, the grandmother who was once dismissed and later reverted, became the story of the village. A story of learning, of regret, but also of redemption. She, who had been ignored in life, was now remembered with respect and dignity, because in the end, what she truly taught was that what matters is not appearances, possessions, or what we have, but what we give to others, and what we leave behind. In her quiet life, she taught that a person's worth is not measured by what they accumulate, but by the impact they have on the hearts of others, and in that, Donna Amalia became a legend in the villager. Legend of silent love, but a love powerful enough to transform everything. It touched. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our